As part of the Global Forecasting School, achieving Level 1 requires students to develop expertise on the U.S. economy. This includes not only a thorough understanding of key areas like inflation, labor markets, product markets, and GDP, but also a deep grasp of how to interpret and analyze economic data. Students must also stay informed about current events, particularly fiscal policy, and form well-reasoned positions on how fiscal policy decisions could influence monetary policy. One critical resource for this analysis is the Congressional Budget Office, CBO. Recently, the CBO released its budget and economic outlook for 2024 to 2034, raising important questions about the sustainability of U.S. fiscal policy. A key challenge for students is to assess whether U.S. fiscal policy is sustainable, and if not, what measures could be taken to address this issue. This involves reviewing the CBO's estimates for debt, deficits, expenditure categories, and revenue sources over the next decade, along with its economic assumptions.
To approach this analysis, we'll start by considering the economically first best solutions without focusing on political constraints. This is crucial because as economists, the first step is to understand the underlying economics clearly before factoring in political realities. This approach avoids the kind of muddled thinking that has led to the current fiscal challenges in the US, where the long-term consequences of government deficits may not have been fully considered. The CBO provides detailed tables summarizing revenues, outlays, total deficits, and primary deficits. The overall deficit represents the annual change in debt, while the primary deficit is the difference between revenues and expenditures excluding interest payments on the debt. The data also includes net interest payments as a distinct outlay category. Currently, the federal debt to GDP ratio is projected to be about 99% at the end of this year, effectively rounding to 100% for ease of analysis. Over the next decade, this ratio is expected to rise to 116%, indicating that the debt trajectory is unsustainable without significant policy changes.
The primary deficit is projected to decline slightly from 2.5% of GDP in 2024 to 2.2% by 2034. While this may appear to be good news, it is actually concerning. To stabilize the debt to GDP ratio, the US government would need to run a primary surplus, spending less than its revenues to cover the interest on the debt. However, net interest payments are projected to rise from 3% of GDP this year to 4% by 2034, driven by both the growing debt and the rollover of existing debt at higher interest rates. Given these projections, U.S. fiscal policy does not appear sustainable. Stabilizing the debt at 100% of GDP would require a primary balance at 0 or better, meaning a shift from the current 2% primary deficit to at least a balanced position. This adjustment could be achieved through a combination of tax increases and spending cuts totaling about 2% of GDP. However, if interest rates rise more than expected, the required adjustment could be even larger. For instance, Larry Summers recently suggested that the 10-year bond rate could reach 5%. Under this scenario, the US would need to run a primary surplus of 1% of GDP, requiring a 3% adjustment to the primary balance. Achieving such a substantial adjustment seems politically challenging in the current environment. The CBO projects real GDP growth to average about 2% annually over the next decade, with inflation also at 2%. This implies a nominal GDP growth of around 4%. If the average maturity of US debt is approximately 8 to 10 years, the interest rate on rolled over debt will play a crucial role. The CBO assumes an interest rate of about 4.1%, roughly equal to nominal GDP growth. This balance suggests that maintaining a stable debt to GDP ratio would require a primary balance at 0. If adjustments are not made, the US faces a day of reckoning where either tax revenues must rise or expenditures must be cut. policymakers will need to consider options like raising taxes by 2% of GDP, cutting expenditures by the same amount, or implementing a mix of both. However, higher interest rates would make this adjustment even more difficult, as they would require larger fiscal changes.
The projections underscore the urgency of addressing U.S. fiscal sustainability. Without action, the rising debt to GDP ratio and increasing interest obligations risk creating an explosive fiscal situation. These challenges highlight the importance of clear economic thinking and informed policy decisions to navigate the political complexities of fiscal reform. To truly understand these debt dynamics and explain them clearly to others, we have created a simple spreadsheet. Let's take a look at it to understand the fundamental problem at hand. Economists often use very simple models because these models can reveal profound insights. While the assumptions in these models are intentionally simplified, they can always be extended in more complex real-world models. However, for the purpose of explaining the core issue, simple models are incredibly effective. In this case, we'll use a basic model to analyze the dynamics of government debt. Instead of using the Congressional Budget Office's CBO estimate of a 4.1% 10-year bond rate, we'll assume a 5% interest rate for government debt. We'll also assume nominal GDP growth of 4% and analyze what happens if the primary balance is zero. We'll show that under these conditions, the debt to GDP ratio will grow explosively at the rate of the difference between the interest rate and the growth rate. Let's break this down intuitively with straightforward calculations. In 2024, the debt to GDP ratio is 99%, but for simplicity, I'll round it to 100%. This assumption makes the calculations easier to follow. Instead of using trillions of dollars as presented in the CBO tables, I'll use $100 for both debt and GDP. This simplification doesn't affect the example's validity as the principles remain the same. Debt in this model starts at $100 in 2024, and national income, GDP, is also $100. The debt to GDP ratio is calculated as debt divided by GDP, expressed as a percentage. Thus, the initial ratio is 100%. Now, let's consider how debt grows over time. Debt increases based on last period's debt, plus the interest payments on that debt. Assuming that all debt rolls over at a 5% interest rate, the interest payments would be 5% of the existing debt. In this example, 5% of $100 equals $5. If no payments are made on the debt, the total debt increases to $105 in 1 year. Simultaneously, the economy grows at a nominal rate of 4%, 2% real growth plus 2% inflation. This means national income increases from $100 to $104 in the same year. The new debt to GDP ratio is calculated by dividing $105 by 104, which results in approximately 101%. Over time, the compounding effect becomes significant. After 10 years, the debt to GDP ratio would rise to approximately 110%, assuming the 5% interest rate and 4% nominal GDP growth continue. The problem arises because financial markets are sensitive to the perception of fiscal instability. If markets believe the government's fiscal policy is unsustainable, they may anticipate future interest rate hikes. This expectation increases the term premium, additional compensation demanded by investors for holding long-term bonds, such as 10-year treasuries. For example, if the interest rate on 10-year bonds rises to 6%, the debt dynamics become even more explosive. Higher interest rates increase the cost of servicing the debt, accelerating its growth. This could create a vicious cycle where higher interest rates lead to greater debt instability, further increasing borrowing costs.
If investors foresee such risks, they will demand even higher premiums, exacerbating the problem. This creates a scenario where long-term government bonds become less attractive, potentially destabilizing financial markets. To address this potential instability, the US government would need to run sustained primary surpluses. This means cutting expenditures, raising taxes, or a combination of both. One effective approach would be to introduce a consumption tax, such as a value-added tax, VAT. A consumption tax is preferable because it discourages consumption, what individuals take out of the economy, rather than production or investment, what individuals contribute to the economy. By taxing consumption rather than income or capital, the government could raise significant revenue without discouraging work, effort, or investment. Most countries globally have adopted VATs for precisely this reason. They are less distortionary compared to income taxes, which discourage labor and capital investment. Introducing such a tax in the US could help stabilize fiscal dynamics, especially in light of rising mandatory expenditures like Social Security and healthcare. Mandatory expenditures, particularly Social Security and healthcare, are significant contributors to fiscal pressures. Social Security currently accounts for about 5.2% of GDP, but is projected to rise over the next decade. Similarly, healthcare spending is expected to increase from 5.6% to 6.7% of GDP. These increases are driven by an aging population, which places additional strain on government resources. If economist Olivier Blanchard is correct, and we return to a low interest rate environment where interest rates are below GDP growth rates, these fiscal pressures may be less concerning. In such a scenario, the debt to GDP ratio would naturally stabilize or decline. However, if Larry Summers' concerns about rising global debt and higher neutral interest rates prove accurate, the situation could deteriorate. The implications of US fiscal instability extend beyond its borders. Higher global interest rates would significantly impact countries with even higher debt levels, such as Italy and Japan. For instance, during the European debt crisis, interest rates in Italy reached critical levels. Today, with higher debt levels, Italy's threshold for fiscal stress is even lower. A similar dynamic applies to Japan. Is US fiscal policy sustainable? The answer is likely no. To ensure sustainability, policymakers must adopt more conservative fiscal strategies to guard against the possibility of high interest rates. This could include introducing a consumption tax and addressing mandatory expenditures. The sooner such measures are implemented, the better, as debt compounds over time. For global forecasting school students, understanding these fiscal dynamics is crucial. They must analyze the US economy comprehensively and apply similar frameworks to other countries they study. Even when focusing on other nations, they must stay informed about the US economy as it has global implications due to integrated capital markets. In summary, addressing the US fiscal situation requires immediate and politically challenging actions. While the situation is not irreparable, it demands careful, forward-thinking policy decisions to ensure long-term stability. See you